The DNA didn't just match a suspect. It named a man everyone trusted. 31 years after a Kentucky teenager vanished. A single lab result shattered a small town's history, friendships, and lies that had aged like stone. Because the killer was never a stranger, never a drifter, never who police chased for decades. He lived quiet. Marid. He buried the truth right alongside the evidence. Tonight, you'll see how a girl disappeared in 1993 and how science finally forced the past to speak. Before we dive into this chilling story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for the full investigation. But first, to understand why that DNA hit mattered, you have to go back to Kentucky in 1993. This was Madison County, before smartphones, before surveillance cameras on every corner, before parents tracked their kids with apps. A place where people still left doors unlocked, where Friday nights meant high school football and diner coffee that never cooled. Everyone knew everyone. And more importantly, everyone trusted everyone. Emily Harper fit perfectly into that world. She was 17, a senior, honor roll student, part-time job at a local grocery store. The kind of kid teachers described as responsible, polite, going places. She wasn't rebellious. She didn't sneak out. She didn't run away. That matters, because when someone like Emily disappears, the silence screams louder than any evidence ever could. October 12th, 1993, started like any other Tuesday. Emily left school that afternoon, drove her old sedan down roads she'd traveled 100 times, and stopped briefly at a gas station just outside town. A cashier remembered her later. So did a classmate who waved as she pulled onto the highway. These were the last confirmed moments of her normal life. She was supposed to be home by 7. She never made it. By midnight, her mother was still staring out the front window, convinced the headlights would turn down the driveway any second. By morning, that certainty collapsed into fear. And by the time police were finally notified, something critical had already slipped away. Time in the early 90s, missing teenagers were often treated as runaways, even when they didn't fit the pattern. Even when the family insisted something was wrong, that hesitation would become the first crack in the case, a delay investigators would regret for decades. When officers finally began asking questions, the town closed ranks. Not out of malice, out of disbelief. People didn't want to imagine something violent could happen here. Because if it could happen to Emily Harper, it could happen to anyone, and somewhere, hiding in plain sight. The truth was already moving farther away. By the second day, panic replaced patience. Emily's car was still missing. Her purse, still on the passenger seat, according to friends, was gone with her. There were no phone calls, no notes, no withdrawals from her bank account. Nothing that even hinted at a planned disappearance. For seasoned investigators, that absence speaks volumes. Runaways leave patterns. Victims leave questions. Kentucky State Police stepped in as local deputies began canvassing the area. Road by road. Farm by farm. They started where logic demanded along the route. Emily took home every afternoon. Ditches were searched. Tree lines were walked. Abandoned barns were checked. K9 units dragged. Scent trails that faded into nothing. And that nothing was important, because it suggested interruption. A stop she didn't intend to make. A moment that went wrong. Detectives reconstructed her final hours with the tools of the time. Witness statements. Handwritten notes. Memory. Unreliable and already fading. One truck driver remembered a sedan pulled onto the shoulder near a rural stretch of highway. Another witness recalled flashing lights but couldn't swear they were police. That detail lingered an unmarked vehicle. Someone with authority or someone pretending to have it. The theory was disturbing, but it fit a pattern investigators had seen before. Still, with no physical evidence, it remained just that, a theory. As the search widened, rumors spread faster than facts. Names were whispered. Old grudges resurfaced. An ex-boyfriend was questioned. A loner from the edge of town. A man passing through. Everyone was looked at. No one was held. Then, 3 weeks later, hunters found what everyone feared. Emily Harper's body was discovered in a wooded ravine, miles from where she was last seen. Hidden, covered, left, deliberately. The crime scene told detectives two things immediately. This wasn't spontaneous, and it wasn't clean. She hadn't wandered there. She had been taken. Now the case wasn't about finding Emily. It was about finding who thought they'd gotten away with murder. The investigation intensified. Overnight, forensic teams worked the scene with urgency. Knowing time had already stolen too much. Fibers were collected. soil samples bagged, biological evidence preserved with care that, at the time, felt routine. DNA testing existed in 1993, but it was limited, fragile, and often inconclusive. Still, detectives pushed forward. They built timelines using gas station logs. They re-interviewed witnesses who now second-guessed their own memories. One man changed his story twice. Another suddenly couldn't recall seeing Emily at all. Whether fear or guilt drove that silence was never clear. A suspect emerged briefly, a man with a history of violence. His truck matched a vague description. He failed a polygraph, then passed another. No charges followed. The evidence wasn't strong enough, and prosecutors refused to gamble months passed. Then years. The case file grew thicker but colder. Leads dried up. Original detectives retired or transferred. New investigators read old notes without the context behind them. Information slipped through the cracks, and slowly, the case slipped out of focus. One item, however, never left evidence storage. A single envelope, carefully sealed, labeled by hand. Inside it, a biological sample collected from the crime scene. At the time, it couldn't speak. The technology simply wasn't ready to hear it. By the late 1990s, the case stalled completely. On paper, it was still active. In reality, it lived in boxers, on shelves, waiting for science to catch up. Waiting for someone to ask the right question. Outside, Madison County moved on. Businesses changed. Roads were repaved. New families moved in, unaware of the story buried beneath their feet. And the person responsible for Emily Harper's death kept living their life, untouched, unchallenged, and convinced the past had finally gone quiet. When a murder has no clear answer, suspicion doesn't disappear. It spreads. In Madison County, it moved quietly, across kitchen tables, through church parking lots, inside low voices, after football games. People didn't accuse out loud, but everyone had a name in mind, sometimes more than one. Detectives followed the noise because sometimes rumors lead to truth. Emily's inner circle was examined first. Friends were questioned, alibis tested. An ex-boyfriend was pulled in multiple times. His relationship with Emily had ended months earlier, cleaned on the surface but tense underneath. Investigators checked phone records and confirmed his whereabouts. The timeline didn't fit. He was released. Then there were the outsiders, a mechanic passing through town, a man with a history of violence who lived near the highway, a former volunteer firefighter who knew the back roads far too well. Each suspect brought a spark of urgency. Each one burned out under scrutiny. One detail continued to unsettle investigators. Several witnesses reported seeing flashing lights along the highway the night Emily vanished. Not confirmed police. Not confirmed emergency vehicles. Just lights. Enough to make someone stop. Enough to make a teenager pull over, believing she was doing the right thing. Impersonation was discussed quietly among detectives. Publicly, it was never confirmed. Without proof, the theory remained locked inside the case file. As weeks turned into months, frustration grew. Families wanted arrests. Media wanted answers. Law enforcement wanted certainty and had none to give. Pressure mounted, and with it came mistakes. One suspect falsely confessed after hours of questioning. The confession unraveled within days. Details didn't match. Facts were wrong. It was a dead end that cost investigators time and credibility. And in small towns, credibility is everything. By the time the first anniversary of Emily's death arrived, the investigation had fractured. Too many theories. Too little evidence. The casa was empty dead, but it was wounded. The town felt it. Parents tightened rules. Teenagers lost freedom. Trust, once taken for granted, became conditional. And still, no one was charged. The question lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. If it wasn't any of them, then who? While suspects came and went, the most important witness never said a word. Not because it didn't want to, because no one could hear it yet. In a secured evidence room, sealed inside aging envelopes, the biological material recovered in 1993 sat untouched. Back then, DNA testing was fragile science. Samples degraded easily. Results were often partial, sometimes useless, and when profiles didn't match anyone in the system, there was nowhere else to look. CODIS was young. Databases were small. Genealogy testing didn't exist, so the evidence was preserved, logged, stored, and quietly forgotten by everyone but the file itself. Years passed, then decades. Technology changed faster than the memories of the people who worked the case. By the early 2000s, DNA could do more, but budgets were tight. Cold cases don't scream. They whisper, and whispers are easy to ignore. But one detective didn't. A new generation investigator, reviewing unsolved homicides for a state cold case initiative, reopened Emily Harper's file. No emotion, no assumptions, just facts, timelines, photos, and that envelope. When the evidence was sent back to the lab, expectations were low. Too much time had passed. Degradation was likely. Failure was common. Then the lab called back. There was a viable profile, not a match. Not yet, but enough genetic material to try again. Enough to give the case something it hadn't had in 30 years. Hope the sample was uploaded. The system searched, and for the first time since 1993, the past stirred. The killer still didn't yet, but the silence was finally breaking. The notification didn't come with sirens or headlines. It arrived as an email. A partial familial DNA hit. Not a suspect, a relative. For detectives who live in cold cases, that distinction is everything. A direct match says someone's name. A familial hit says a family tree is about to be shaken. It means the answer exists, but it's hiding inside bloodlines, marriages, births, and deaths. It means the investigation is no longer looking backward. It's moving forward. Analysts began constructing genetic maps. Cousins, second cousins, distant relatives who had volunteered their DNA for reasons that had nothing to do with Emily Harper. Curiosity, health, family history. None of them knew they were knocking on the door of a murder committed decades earlier. This is where modern detective work stops feeling like police work and starts looking like intelligence gathering. Detectives paired DNA with geographer who lived near Madison County in 1993, who had ties to the area, who disappeared from records after that year. They cross-referenced employment logs, utility connections, property sales. Slowly. A short list emerged. One name sat uncomfortably close to the center, a man who had lived locally in the early 90s. No criminal record. No early suspicion. Someone who had given statements once and then faded into the background. He had moved on with his life, built a reputation, built trust, and that's when the case shifted. Because for the first time, investigators weren't asking who could have done it. They were asking who hid so well that no one ever thought to look. As the genetic net tightened, so did the pressure. Detectives had to be flawless. One mistake could collapse the case or taint the evidence beyond repair. Warrants were drafted slowly. Language was checked. Every move had to survive court, scrutiny, and time itself. Investigators began quiet surveillance. Nothing dramatic. No raids. Just observation, routines, patterns. Who this man was now, compared to who he was in 1993. Neighbors described him as dependable. Co-workers called him steady. No one suspected violence. That, in many ways, made him more dangerous. Because history shows, the most effective killers are rarely who we expect. Detectives compared old witness statements with current findings. His vehicle history aligned with descriptions given decades earlier. His work schedule placed him near the highway that night. Not proof, but alignment. When investigators requested a direct DNA sample, protocol moved slowly. Legal grounds were airtight. When the confirmation finally came back, the lab didn't hedge. The profile matched. 31 years after Emily Harper disappeared. Science finished the sentence. Everyone else had started. The question now wasn't whether he did it. It was whether justice could still reach him. Before the arrest, doubt crept in. The suspect's attorney moved fast. Motions were filed. Evidence was challenged. Defense experts argued contamination, degradation, coincidence. The familiar cold case defense strategy unfolded. One the justice system has seen again and again. For a moment, it looked like history might repeat itself. The family prepared for disappointment. Detectives braced for a fight. 31 years of waiting had led to this edge, where everything could fall apart again. But the evidence held. The DNA wasn't alone this time. It was supported by timelines, geography, inconsistencies in early statements, and technological clarity that simply didn't exist in 1993. The case wasn't emotional. It was methodical. When the arrest warrant was signed, it wasn't dramatic. It was heavy. Officers arrived quietly. Neighbors watched from behind curtains. The suspect didn't resist. He didn't deny. He said nothing. And that silence spoke volumes. For the first time since that October night, the truth was no longer hiding. It was in custody. In Madison County. Would never be the same again. The arrest wasn't the end of the story. It was the moment the story demanded proof. Inside the cold case courthouse, prosecutors rebuilt 1993, piece by piece. They didn't rely on emotion. They relied on alignment, evidence meeting opportunity, science, confirming memory, old questions, finally answering each other. The suspect's past was examined under a new lens, where he lived, where he worked. Why his account from decades ago suddenly didn't sit right when placed beside modern data. Early inconsistencies, once dismissed as forgetfulness, now looked deliberate. Cell tower reconstruction placed him along Emily's route. Employment logs showed unaccounted time. Witness statements that once felt vague began to overlap. Not dramatically, precisely, like parts of a machine, finally clicking into place. This was the turning point. Investigators wait their entire careers for not a confession, not luck, but convergence. The case didn't break open. It locked shut when the trial began. The courtroom felt suspended in time. Emily Harper's family filled the front row. Some holder, so may change. None, expecting they'd still be here 3 decades later. The defense painted uncertainty. They questioned memory. They challenged procedure. They warned against trusting modern science too much. Then the experts testified. Forensic analysts explained how degraded DNA from 1993 was reprocessed, using technology that didn't exist when the evidence was first collected. They explained familial matching, statistical certainty, probability so narrow it left no room for coincidence. Jurors followed the evidence visually. Charts, timelines, genetic trees. This wasn't just a story being told. It was being demonstrated. The most powerful moment came without drama. An expert looked at the jury and said the words that ended the mystery. This DNA does not belong to a stranger. It belongs to the man seated at the defense table. There was no reaction. No outburst. Just understanding. Emily Harper still didn't have a voice. But the science spoke clearly enough for everyone. The verdict came quickly. Guilty. Not because of one piece of evidence, but because of all of it, working together. They didn't see a cold case. They saw a solved one. A crime delayed, not denied. A truth that waited patiently for science to catch up. Sentencing followed. The judge spoke about time, about accountability, about how justice doesn't expire simply because decades have passed. The defendant listened silently, the same quiet that had followed him since 1993. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. The town watched. And for the first time in a generation, Madison County exhaled that Emily Harper didn't get to grow up, didn't get to leave town, didn't get to live the life everyone assumed she would. But she got something else. Her name cleared, her story finished, and a truth that refused to stay buried forever. Justice didn't bring relief the way people expected. When the courtroom emptied and the cameras left, Madison County had to sit with what it learned. For 31 years, the crime had been an abstract fear. Now, it had a face, a name, a history woven into the town itself. Neighbors replayed memories, conversations, small moments that now felt different. Detectives reflected on limitations, on how close they may have been without realizing it. And Emily Harper's family faced the strange burden. Closure brings the kind that ends waiting but never heals loss. The case reshaped how cold cases were handled statewide. Evidence preservation protocols changed. Funding increased. Training expanded. Emily's case became a reference point, not just for what went wrong, but for what finally went right. Silence didn't end the case. Science did. And that distinction mattered. On the edge of Madison County, there's a stretch of road most people drive past without noticing. It's been paved over, widened, modernized. No markers, no signs, just traffic moving forward. That's where the case once went cold. Today, life there feels ordinary again. Kids drive the same routes. Families stopped for gas. High school football still fills the nights, but something unspoken lingers. Awareness, a knowledge earned the hard way. Because evil didn't arrive from outside. It waited inside. Familiarity. Emily Harper's name is spoken now with purpose, not questions. She's remembered not just as a victim, but as the reason a truth surfaced, a system evolved, and a town learned the cost of assuming safety. The past didn't disappear. It was finally heard. Cold cases aren't stories about the past. They're warnings to the present. Emily Harper's case proves that time doesn't protect guilt. That evidence, when preserved, remembers what people forget, and that justice isn't about speed. It's about certainty. Somewhere, right now, another file is sitting in a box, sealed and silent, not waiting for luck, waiting for patience, waiting for technology, waiting for someone to care enough to look again. Because the truth has a habit. It waits, and then it comes back. The sentence closed the case, but it didn't close the wound. 31 years is a long time to wait for accountability. Long enough for memories to fade, witnesses to age, and entire lives to be lived in the shadow of an unanswered question. Justice arrived, but it arrived late, carrying a weight no verdict could fully lift. Late, carrying a weight no verdict could fully lift. Emily Harper's parents stood quietly after sentencing. They didn't celebrate. They didn't smile, because what they wanted most could never be returned. What the law offered instead was confirmation, proof, an end to doubt that had followed them through every holiday, every birthday that went uncelebrated. For investigators, the moment was sobering. This was not a win. It was a responsibility honored. Detectives who worked cold cases know this truth well. Every solved file is also a reminder of time lost, of technology that wasn't ready, of signs missed, of how thin the line is between justice delayed and justice denied. But the system held. Evidence spoke, and a man who believed time had buried his crime learned it never truly does. Emily Harper's case changed more than one family's life. It changed how Kentucky handled its past. After the conviction, law enforcement agencies across the state reviewed old evidence rooms with new urgency. Biological samples once considered useless were re-examined. Case files were digitized. Cold case units received funding and training directed toward forensic genealogy and advanced DNA recovery. Professional investigators often say cold cases don't fail because of indifference, but because of limitation. This case proved that limitation doesn't last forever. The lesson was simple and uncomfortable. A crime doesn't vanish because it goes unsolved. It just waits. Emily's case became part of law enforcement training, cited not for its brutality, but for its persistence. A demonstration of why procedure matters, why preservation matters, why no piece of evidence is ever truly obsolete, because someday, science will ask questions the past couldn't answer. In the end, this story isn't about DNA. It's about patience. It's about a 17-year-old girl whose voice was silenced, and a system that refused to let silence become permanent. It's about investigators who understood that truth isn't always immediate, but it is relentless. Somewhere, tonight, another family is waiting. Another case sits unsolved, labeled cold, only because time has passed, not because hope has disappeared. Emily Harper's story stands as proof. Time does not erase guilt. Familiarity does not equal safety, and the truth does not forget. It waits, and eventually, it finds its way home. Years have passed since the trial, but the town of Madison County still carries Emily Harper's memory in subtle ways. Streetlights illuminate roads she once traveled. Schools hold assemblies that honor her life, and a quiet awareness lingers in the air. People speak her name with reverence, not fear. Life has moved forward, but the story remains. New families settle. Teenagers laugh and drive down familiar highways, unaware of the history beneath their wheels. Yet, somewhere in every conversation about trust, safety, and community, Emily's absence echoes. The trees along the rural highway sway as if remembering. The creek where detectives once searched reflects sunlight like evidence waiting to be seen. And the quiet of Madison County is no longer naive. It is what fully informed and forever changed. Emily Harper may never have grown up. She may never have lived the life she deserved. But through truth, persistence, and justice, her story has finally returned to the world, and the town will never forget.